Welcome to Chandwell. I'm Michael Scott and this is a look at what I've been up to in October. I finally made a start on the platform tops and I progressed with my industrial works building as part of my Inkscape series. If you watch the way through to the end, there's a chance to name that building, so please do that if you can. I also answer a question from a viewer about how I used Inkscape to create my control panel for Chandwell. So let's get straight into it. I decided that before I start on the river and other grand plans that I've mentioned in previous videos, I'd better start finishing off some of the things that have never quite been completed. None is more of an example of this than the station platforms. I'm using the Scale Scenes kit and I put the sides of the platforms in a couple of years ago, before I even started the YouTube channel. I had a couple of bits to finish off and that's just the end bits here. So I already had these bits half completed, I just never got around to gluing them down. So started by gluing these into position and then I needed to work out how to put the platform tops on. The Scale Scenes kit is quite clear in this, it's quite a simple method really, but I did find it difficult to get it accurate and I'll show you how I mean in a second. So with the platform edging in place, I essentially sellotaped enough strips of A4 paper together to match the full length of the platforms. So here we are. It's then just a case of pinning that on top of the platform edges, all the way along both sides. So it should be fairly simple to do. Got some pins. Let's give it a go. So I found putting them onto the top of the platform edges was quite straightforward. It fit quite nicely, the pins go into the cardboard edging quite nicely, so that bit was fairly straightforward, didn't struggle with that. The next bit is interesting, it's how do you get the actual edges into the right place. And it's quite a nice technique actually. If you went to school and you ever did rubbings of things, you'll remember what you do. You get a pencil and you gradually, gently rub all the way along the platform edges. I folded the paper a little bit just to make it obvious where I was going, and then just using the edge of the pencil just gradually sketched along both platforms, both sides. So overall that went well, although to be honest I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do down this end yet. I think it's going to depend on where I'm going to put the station buildings and things, so for now I'm just taking the platforms down as far as the buffer stops and I'll work out this bit later. So we have our platforms shaped, and the next thing to do is cut some strips of 1mm grey board and sellotape those together as well. So we've got a full length piece of card, and what I'll do is, using my usual technique for buildings, I'm just going to use glue stick and I'm going to stick the strips of the paper along these and let that glue dry before I then cut them out. So let's give that a go. As ever, I'm using cheap glue sticks that I get off eBay. Took me a while to get them down. The platforms curve a little bit, so it was sometimes a little bit difficult to get them lined up properly on the card, but I got there in the end, and then after leaving it for a few hours to dry, it's a simple case of beginning to cut this out, and this is where the problems started really. Because the sketched line wasn't as well defined as I hoped it would be, it was difficult to tell where the actual edge should be, and I was also not quite sure whether I should overhang the edge a little bit. So I did my best when cutting, and when I got them actually into place, it's not that far off, but it's not perfect. In some areas it overhangs the platform edge a little bit, and that's okay because I can trim that back, but in others it doesn't quite reach far enough, so I'm not really sure that I've done this right or not. But I'm going to progress anyway. So I've got some Scale Scenes tarmac texture here, and I'm just putting it on top of the card platforms. I'm trimming it like this, and I'm blackening the edges with a grey marker, just to remove the obvious white line where they join. And I'm using my usual technique again, just Pritt stick equivalent, and then stick it on. Make sure there's no bubbles and things. And although I'm going to put edging stones or something around the edges of the platforms, I still decided to wrap the edges of the tarmac texture around the platform. My idea was there just to make it stick out that little bit further, so that when the extra layer is put on as well, then the platform does overhang the upright parts a little bit. And although I'm not finished yet, I think it is going in the right direction. It looks a little bit scruffy, but like I said, there's going to be another edging piece wrapped around the edge there, so it'll look a lot less scruffy later on. It fits quite nicely. It looks so much better than when it was just the raw uprights. And it looks okay. I'm not overly happy, however, with how I've done the joins here. I know you can't see a white line because I darkened it with the pen, but you can see a very definitive straight line. So I'm not sure whether I'm happy with that or not. It looks okay on the whole, but that line I just need to think about. This is Chandwell, where I'm scratch building a city viaduct layout in N Gauge. If you want to follow along, please subscribe. October saw me put part 3 of my Inkscape based industrial building series onto YouTube, and I got a nice comment from Trevor Ward, who was asking about using Inkscape for creating his control panel on his 00 gauge layout. And Trevor, the answer is yes, you can use Inkscape to make control panels. In fact, I used Inkscape to make this, which is Chandwell's control panel. It's a DC layout, as you might know, so there's lots of switches for the sections and also the point motors, which I haven't installed yet. And I also use handheld controllers, which I plug into the control panel as well. I'm going to show you how I did Chandwell's control panel and give you some tips, but I thought you might like to see some other ideas. This is a very simple one for my 00 gauge shunting layout, Pig Hill Yard. It's just a few lines, 3 switches and 4 LEDs. But you can use different styles as well. So this one, for an early version of Chandwell, which I never built, is just quite straightforward, straight lines joining up where the points are and things. Something like this, however, is also possible. This was again something I never actually built, but it was for a round and round layout that I was going to use some kind of microprocessor to control. So there's far fewer switches. It's a lot cleaner looking. But again, it's just straight lines, circles, and diagonal lines for the points and the junctions and things. So that's another idea that works nicely. One of my favourite ideas though is to actually base your design on a real signal box diagram. So I did a lot of research into what signal box diagrams look like, and I came up with this. So again, this is just using lines, but this time they are not just straight, there's curves in there as well. And I'm using the colours that you find on real signal box diagrams as well. Now something like this takes a lot more effort and a lot more trial and error, and you need to know your way around Inkscape a lot more. But I think it gives you an idea of what you could do with Inkscape. I think if this was printed really large and had some large LEDs on it and some switches and things, I think it would look really good. It would be a centerpiece to put above your layout. I never actually made Stanley Lane Junction, but if you look closely, you'll see that it's more or less the same track plan as what ended up being Chandwell. Whatever you do though, I suggest you start with something like this. This is just some straight lines and some colours, and I started to make some notes as to what worked well. So trial and error basically, but do that, and once you get an actual style in mind, do something like this and just make notes on it as to what actually is what. So let's take a look at Chandwell's control panel. I'll start off with a grid, and if we look here at the document properties, we'll see the size of the grid that I've chosen for Chandwell. This was chosen to fit the space that I had, but I decided a spacing of 1.5mm horizontally and 2.5mm vertically, and I'd have a major grid line every 8 squares. So what that's given us is this. There's the major grid lines, and if we zoom in, you'll see the smaller blue ones. And what I wanted the horizontal lines that represent the tracks of Chandwell to be along the major grid lines, so the pink lines. Now it's good in Inkscape because you can snap all the lines to that you're drawing to the grid. And if we look here, I started with the very basic outline of the track plan. So there's the track plan. I'll turn the grid off again so you can see it. What I wanted is every line, every railway line and every point on there, and I used the size of the grid to get the angles I wanted. The size of the grid was determined by the amount of space that I had in the layout to put the control panel. So you might not use horizontal lines and vertical lines that are spaced exactly like this, but trial and error gets you where you need to in the end. So once you've got the basic outline, it's time to start putting the actual tracks on themselves. So here are Chandwell's tracks. Essentially it's just coloured lines that I've drawn directly over the black outlines in a separate layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on this and show you how I did this. So essentially each line is just a line drawn by itself. It's got curved edges rather than straight edges, just to give it that kind of like more flowing shape. And you'll see here that that's just a simple line constructed in Inkscape. So how did I do that? Let's put this back and I will show you. So I'm going to turn the grid back on. Using the line tool, I'm just going to draw a simple line. Click, 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 click. So we've now got a line, which is the piece of track that we're wanting to colour in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the node tool. I'm going to double click at this point, just before the transition of the angle, and this point. So that gives us an extra node there. You can see we can move it around. And I'm going to double click here as well to add one in the centre. I'm then going to delete this one by selecting it and choosing the remove node button, and then this one as well. So what that does, that gives us those nice curves, and we can then drag these handles, which alter the shape of the curve, into the point where the transition should be from one angle to the next. And we'll do the same there as well, and it's as simple as that to get that nice sweeping curve. So you don't need to worry about anything else, because everything snaps to the grid, it's all nice. We can then select that line and make it, I don't know, say 5mm thick. Right, making that, so now I've got a 5mm wide line, and it follows quite nicely. We can then duplicate that line if we wanted by pressing Ctrl D. So press Ctrl D and you'll see that it puts a copy of the line on top of the original line. So there it is. We can then put that back and change its colour and then decrease the width a little bit. So that gives a nice black outline. So it's not really a black outline outside the orange line, it's just a thick black line underneath a slightly narrower white line. We can do that again, Ctrl D to duplicate, and this time make it a lot thicker. So if we make that line thicker, and then move it to the back, so it's at the back, and then change its colour. What we've got then is we've got a different coloured line at the bottom. Now I'm going to drag that on top of that blue line underneath, and bring it to the top, and then make the grey line white. And that is a good way of making it look like one line goes over or under another one. And I use that where the points deviate so that you can see the normal route of the points. And that's a nice technique to use, and I use that all over the place. You'll see that shortly. So some other tips if you're going to do something like this yourself. Here, this dotted square, that is the actual measurements of the back of the switches that I was using. So I measured that accurately and put those on there. That just ensured that as I was making the control panel, I wasn't putting switches in places where they wouldn't physically fit. So that works quite nicely. And you can see here where I've got the numbers, they're just basically text in circles, very simple. Everything that I do in Inkscape is just made up of very, very basic shapes. So it looks nice together, and it's all aligned to the grids, but it's just very basic shapes. You can use the same technique with your lines. So this nice double arrow here, that's just a line on exactly the same grid as the rest. I'm just using the minor grid lines here just to get it all snapped into place. So it's just a line, the curve works exactly the same way as the main curve on the line that it's on top of. And I just use the arrowheads to add the nice little arrows. That just shows the direction of travel on that section of track. You might not want to put that on there, but I thought it looked quite nice. I had the correct size holes to cut out for the other components that are going to go on there, and I always add a nice little signature at the bottom as well. These curves here, these elaborate corners, they're just circles joined together in a certain way. I might go through and do that in a tutorial in future at some point, 'cause it's a nice thing. And then obviously I put the platforms on as well, so just have a bit of fun really, and put whatever information you want on your control panel, but the most important thing is making sure that it's legible and that there's space for your switches. Here are the points that I was talking about. Again, this is just simple lines like this that sit underneath the main lines. So again, they were just drawn on the grid. And then I use a little tiny line, a little white line, just to put across the transition of the colours. That just keeps them separated nicely. I think that's only about 0.5 millimeter wide, but it looks really nice. So I tidied it up, I changed some of the colours, I got rid of the circles where the switches would go, I just replaced them with simple up and down lines, crosshairs if you like, just so that when I get my drill out and I target it, it's much easier to get the centre of the circles without risking any of the outlines of the circles showing. So I tidied it up, I changed a few of the bits and pieces, some of the colours have changed if you can see here, but this is the final version of the control panel. Now it's bigger than a single sheet of A4 paper, so it's not something that I could print out myself, not without having to do some kind of joins which might show up. So I sent this off to a commercial printers. Now they might accept SVG files, but what I did is I used the export function or the save as function just to change the saving format to PDF. Every printer in the world will accept PDF files, so exporting or saving your drawing as a PDF file is the best way to get that printed. So Trevor, I hope that answered some of your questions, or it has inspired you a little bit. I might do a full tutorial about control panels in future in my Inkscape series, but I need to get the building out of the way with first. So speaking of the building, let's have a look at how that's coming on. So I spent some time in October working on the building, and I've now got the front on. Well, it's not on, as you'll see in a minute. It's not finished yet. I've got a couple of the frontage parts done. Got quite a few more to go. It's slow progress, working on this and also outputting the Inkscape series takes a lot of effort. Those videos of the Inkscape take a lot of time to put together. So this building is going slower than it otherwise would, but it's looking okay. So let's take a closer look at what I've been up to. It's still nice and sturdy, and the front is here. The front is put on 0.5mm card because there's going to be a back to it as well. I've done some different coloured bricks just to add some detail to the front, and I'm going to add on some ledges as well. And put these bottom bits on. I made a mistake, I've put them too high, but it doesn't look too bad when it's against the road, so I'm not going to worry about that. And I've got those upright buttresses in place as well, and there's going to be triangular pieces on top of that. You'll see the way that I wrap the card, I wrap the texture around the apertures for the windows just so there's no exposed card edges, and I've done the same with the plinth at the bottom. I'm going to put something along the top of the windows here, like what's on the real building. Eventually, that's my next step. So it's a long way off finished, but I think it's coming on. I'm quite pleased with how it's looking. In the middle there, above the arch, there's going to be a sign. Can't quite decide what to call this building, so that's where you come in. If you're watching this, please give me a suggestion for what my building is going to be called. The prototype is called Spartan Works. I want something similar to that, but something a bit more inspired. So please offer me suggestions. All the suggestions that I get, as long as they're not too rude, I will put to the panel of my children and they can decide what it is going to be called. So this is your chance to have this building named after your layout or your dog or your cat or whatever you want. So please offer me a suggestion and we will choose a winner. And in my next layout update, you'll see what this building is finally called. I hope this video has been of interest to you. As ever, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for all the comments that you add on my videos. And also thank you to all my new subscribers. I'm now on 825 as of this morning. I couldn't be happier with that. That's wonderful. If I have the good fortune to get to 1,000 subscribers, I'm going to do a question and answers video. So please, if you've got any questions, any at all, about the layout, about the techniques I use, about anything that you'd like me to answer, please drop a question in the comments and I will do a 1,000 subscriber special where I answer all of your questions. So please get those coming if that's of interest. If you're interested in watching the continued evolution of Chandwell, please subscribe by pressing that +47 button just there on screen.